On the 26th of November 2003, they shut the A38 road north of Bristol, not because of an accident, not because of roadworks, because tens of thousands of people had abandoned their cars and were standing on the verge, on bridges, on rooftops, anywhere they could get a view of the sky. They were waiting for one last look. And when it came, that long white needle of a plane, impossibly elegant, dropping low over the Clifton suspension bridge before banking towards Filton, grown men wept. Women held their children up to see it. People who built it with their own hands stood in silence and watched it land for the very last time. The engines went quiet, and that was it. No plane has flown passengers faster than Concorde since that day. No plane comes close. More than 20 years later, that record still stands. So how did Britain help build the most extraordinary passenger aircraft in history and then just let it go? Stay with me. Because the answer involves a piece of metal the size of a ruler, a decision made in a boardroom, and a runway that was quietly closed and sold for housing. The story starts not with an aircraft, but with a question. It is 1954. Britain has just emerged from the war. The empire is crumbling. The Americans and the Soviets are the new superpowers. And a small committee of engineers, meeting quietly in a government office, is asking something that sounds almost absurd. Could Britain build a passenger plane that flies faster than sound? Not a fighter jet, not a military prototype. A plane that carries ordinary passengers, businessmen, diplomats, the wealthy, across the Atlantic in the time it takes to have lunch. The committee said yes, and the place they chose to build it was Filton, a sprawling airfield and factory complex on the northern edge of Bristol, which had been building aircraft since 1910. By the time serious work began on what would become Concorde in the early 1960s, Filton employed thousands of Bristol workers. Families where the father worked on the airframe, the son worked on the engines, the neighbour worked in the design office. Generations of Bristol people whose entire working lives were bound up in what happened inside those hangars. And the project they were now given was the most ambitious thing British engineering had ever attempted. But before I tell you what they built, I need to tell you something about Concorde that I had to double check, because it seemed too small a detail to be true. The name Concorde, that single word that came to represent the pinnacle of human flight, was suggested by an 18-year-old boy. He was the son of the publicity manager at the British Aircraft Corporation's Filton plant. 18 years old, he suggested the name to his father, who passed it on, and it stuck. The word means harmony, agreement, union between Britain and France, who were building it together. An 18-year-old boy named it, and then 8,000 people in Bristol spent the next decade building it. But what none of them know yet is that the plane they are about to create will set a record that stands for over half a century, and that one morning, without ceremony, Britain will simply decide to stop flying it. What Concorde actually was is almost impossible to describe without the numbers sounding made up. It cruised at Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, 1,350 miles per hour. At that speed, it flew at 60,000 feet, nearly twice the altitude of a normal passenger jet. High enough that passengers looking out of the window could see the curvature of the Earth. London to New York took 3 hours and 30 minutes. A normal flight today takes 7 to 8 hours. Concorde did it before lunch. The engines were Rolls-Royce Olympus 593S, developed and built in Bristol. When Concorde took off, it used more fuel in the first 30 seconds than a family car uses in a year. The nose drooped on takeoff and landing to give the pilots visibility, and then rose again for supersonic cruise, giving Concorde that unmistakable predatory silhouette. A dart. A needle. Something that looked like it belonged in a different century to everything flying around it. It was not just a plane. It was proof of what Britain could do when it decided to try. Concorde entered commercial service on the 21st of January 1976. British Airways and Air France flew the first scheduled routes simultaneously, London to Bahrain, Paris to Rio. Within a few years, the London to New York route was established, and that became the heartbeat of the operation. And at Filton, at the peak of production and operation, the scale of what this meant to Bristol was staggering. The hangars were vast, the kind of space that makes you feel small the moment you walk in. Ceilings lost in shadow, aircraft in various states of assembly, the smell of aviation fuel and hot metal, and the particular dry warmth of a working engine bay. The sound was different to any other factory. Not the rattle and clang of a production line, the low whine of turbine tests, the hiss of hydraulics. And underneath everything, the voices of engineers calling to each other across distances too large for ordinary conversation. Men who had spent so long in those hangars, they could identify a problem by sound alone. 8,000 Bristol workers at the peak of the program. Apprentices who had joined at 16 still working the same site 30 years later. Fathers who brought their children in on open days and pointed at the white fuselage and said, "I worked on that. I put that together with my hands." British Airways operated 7 Concordes. They were repositioned as the ultimate luxury service, the only way to cross the Atlantic and arrive before you left, in terms of local time. Rock stars, royalty, prime ministers. The Queen flew on Concorde to Barbados for her Silver Jubilee in 1977. Margaret Thatcher flew on it. Tony Blair flew on it. The Pope flew on it. And according to British Airways' own figures, it was profitable, making around £30 million a year in the years before the disaster. £30 million profit every year on a plane that had been written off as commercially unviable before it ever flew. The thing worked. The thing actually worked. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in July 2000, a piece of metal fell off another aircraft on a runway in Paris. The 25th of July 2000, Charles de Gaulle Airport, Air France Flight 4590, a charter flight bound for New York. 5 minutes before Concorde rolled onto runway 26R, a Continental Airlines DC-10 had taken off from the same runway. And as it went, a titanium wear strip fell from one of its engine cowlings onto the tarmac. The strip was about 43 centimeters long, the width of a ruler. Concorde's front tire ran over it at takeoff speed. The tire exploded. A chunk of rubber, 4.5 kilograms, traveling at 140 meters per second, struck the underside of the wing and ruptured the fuel tank. Burning fuel poured from the wing. The engines surged. The aircraft could not stop and could not climb. 113 people died when Flight 4590 crashed into a hotel in Gonesse 2 minutes after takeoff. The entire Concorde fleet was grounded immediately. It was the only fatal accident in Concorde's 27-year service history. One piece of metal dropped by another aircraft on one runway on one afternoon. That is all it took. Concorde returned to service in November 2001 after a £17 million safety program. New reinforced fuel tanks, Kevlar linings, redesigned tyres. The engineers had fixed it. The plane was safe. But the world had changed. September 11, 2001 happened 2 weeks before Concorde's return to service. Business travel collapsed. The passengers who could afford Concorde, the bankers, the executives, the celebrities, stopped flying. And British Airways and Air France looked at the numbers. Rising maintenance costs on an aging fleet. Falling passenger numbers. Airbus, who supplied the aircraft's parts, announced they would no longer support the program. Without spare parts, Concorde could not fly. In April 2003, the retirement was announced. British Airways flew their last commercial Concorde flight on the 24th of October 2003. And on the 26th of November 2003, the last Concorde ever built, registration G BOAF, took off from Heathrow, flew out over the Bay of Biscay, turned north, came in low over Weston-super-Mare, swept over the Clifton Suspension Bridge with tens of thousands watching from below, and landed at Filton. The birthplace. Coming home. The airport manager at Filton, Alan Haley, had planned that final route himself. He had suggested the flight over the Clifton Bridge specifically so that Bristol could say goodbye properly, so that the city that built it could watch it come home one last time. The runway was shut behind it, and Filton Airfield closed permanently on the 31st of December 2012. Part of the site is now a housing estate. People ask who killed Concorde. Was it the Paris crash? Was it September 11th? Was it Airbus pulling the part's support? Was it the British and French governments who had subsidized the program for decades and then quietly withdrew? Was it the sonic boom, which meant Concorde could only fly supersonically over the ocean, limiting its routes and its revenue forever? The honest answer is all of those things, and the collision between them. Concorde was always expensive to operate, always limited in where it could fly, always dependent on a very narrow market of passengers wealthy enough to pay the fares. The Paris crash damaged public confidence at exactly the moment when 9/11 destroyed the economics. No single villain, just a chain of events, each one reasonable in isolation, that together ended the supersonic age. And the thing that still quietly astonishes is that nobody replaced it. The Americans abandoned their own supersonic program years before. The Russians built one that rarely flew, and Britain and France built the only supersonic passenger aircraft that ever actually worked, and retired it. More than 20 years later, nobody has flown passengers faster. There is a team that refused to accept that ending. For years after retirement, enthusiasts, engineers, and former British Airways staff campaigned to return Concorde to the skies, not commercially, just heritage flights, to let people hear those engines one more time. In 2010, two groups tried to source Rolls-Royce Olympus engines to get a Concorde airborne for the 2012 Olympics. They failed. The engines weren't available, the will wasn't there, but the planes themselves were saved. 18 of the 20 Concordes built are preserved and on display in museums across Britain, France, and the United States. And the last one ever built, G. Boaf, the one that made that final flight over the Clifton Bridge, sits at Aerospace Bristol at Filton. You can walk on board, you can sit in the seats, you can stand in the cockpit and look down the runway where it first flew in 1969. Every year on the 26th of November, the nose dips at exactly 1:07 in the afternoon. The precise moment it touched down for the last time in 2003. The nose still dips, the engines are silent, but they haven't quite let it go. Concorde collectors exist in a particular category of obsessive. Not the kind of collector who hunts factory seconds and auction rooms. The kind who spent careers inside those hangars and cannot quite bring themselves to let the connection end. The Holy Grail, the thing that serious Concorde collectors have spent decades hunting, is a boarding pass from British Airways' final commercial flight, October 24th, 2003. London Heathrow to London Heathrow, the ceremonial final journey. Only a handful of passengers on board. The boarding passes were kept as mementos by almost everyone who held one. On the rare occasion one surfaces, and they do occasionally at specialist aviation auctions, the bidding gets serious very quickly. A piece of card, a flight that lasted a few hours. A memory of the morning Britain stopped flying faster than sound. The Concorde story is not quite like the others. It is not the story of a factory that slowly crumbled, of a workforce that watched their jobs move abroad, of a brand that was sold and hollowed out by people who didn't understand what they had bought. It is the story of something Britain helped build that was genuinely, undeniably, the best in the world at what it did. The fastest, the most elegant, the most extraordinary passenger aircraft ever flown. And it is the story of how that wasn't enough. Because in the end, the economics won. They usually do. The skills didn't disappear. The knowledge didn't disappear. The engineers who built Concorde went on to work on Airbus, on the Eurofighter, on the next generation of aircraft. Bristol is still an aerospace city, but the thing they made, the actual thing, the white needle in the sky that made people stop in the street and stare upwards, that's gone. And nothing has come back to replace it. Could Concorde have been saved? If the Paris crash had never happened, if that titanium strip had been properly installed on the Continental DC-10, would Concorde still be flying today? If Airbus had continued supporting the program? If the British and French governments had found the will? If the sonic boom restrictions had been lifted or new routes opened? I don't know, nobody does. But I think about those tens of thousands of people standing on the A38 on a November morning in 2003 watching it come home. Nobody told them to be there. There was no official ceremony. They just came because they understood instinctively that they were watching something end that was never coming back. Britain helped build the fastest passenger aircraft in history, and then stood on the roadside and watched it land for the last time. Were you there that day on the A38? Did your family work at Filton? Did you ever fly on Concorde or stand somewhere and watch it go overhead?